Welcome to APUSH Unit 8 review, and today we'll be covering these topics. So let's start off with the Roaring Twenties. Let's start off with some big ideas. We're going to see a lot of advancements, changes in society, and economic developments in the Roaring Twenties. The big question is, was the Roaring Twenties really roaring? Keep this question in mind as we cover many of these trends. So the first big idea is that the first Red Scare was driven by a lot of fear and paranoia after World War I. Well, why does this happen? Well, there's a few reasons. Obviously, there's the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and Americans are going to become wary of the growing communism in the world, the antithesis to democracy and capitalism. There's going to be a lot of strikes, like the steel strike of 1919 and the Boston police strike of 1919, and these are going to be seen as radical labor movements, and people fear a socialist uprising. We're also going to see race riots like the Chicago race riot of 1919, and these are going to happen because of competition for jobs and housing. And finally, there were bombings in 8 cities. Now, none of these are actually interconnected, but this causes a lot of fear and paranoia, leading to the first Red Scare. And the big thing that you should know are the Palmer raids, a series of raids led by General A. Mitchell Palmer that arrested thousands of suspected socialists. Now, trends in immigration. So following World War I, there's going to be a severe nativist reaction, and immigration is going to be heavily restricted. There's a continuity of paranoia and hatred of the new immigrants that we saw in Unit 6, and part of this reason was because they came from countries with communism. Now, the Palmer raids and the Red Scare are really going to drive this nativism and paranoia because people think that immigrants were trying to start a socialist revolution. We're going to see the passage of the Quota Act of 1921, which severely limits immigration, and the National Quota Act of 1924, which limits immigration even more and was intended to target new immigrants. In fact, this act banned Japanese immigration altogether and heavily restricted Asian immigration. However, national policies are going to allow unrestricted immigration from the Western Hemisphere, the most notable of which were Mexican migrant farm workers working in agriculture. We're also going to see the rise of the KKK. The big idea is that the KKK will greatly expand their influence in the 1920s. They're going to spread beyond the South into areas like the Midwest, and they don't hate blacks anymore, but also immigrants, Catholics, and radicals. There's this film called Birth of a Nation that is wildly popular in American theaters, and this film was pro-KKK. They're going to have 5 million members by 1925, and this is because they branded themselves as patriotic. And their largest support is going to come from white Protestants, especially in rural areas, and they're going to have massive political power as well. One case that you should know is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. The big idea is that the Sacco and Vanzetti case symbolize the growing tensions during this time period. Sacco and Vanzetti are Italian immigrants who were charged with murder and robbery, and the controversy comes because a lot of people believe that anti-immigrant, anti-anarchist biases are going to play a big role in the trial. Ultimately, these two are going to be executed in 1927. So why was this called the Roaring Twenties? Well, the big idea is that the 1920s was a period of massive economic growth and prosperity. 1920 is going to be the first time the majority of Americans live in urban areas, and there's going to be a lot of prosperity. For example, the stock market is going to skyrocket, and this is partially due to people buying on margin or taking out loans to invest. There's a lot of speculation, and this is highly risky, and you know that this is going to be one of the big causes of the Great Depression. We also see the rise of consumerism. Affordable goods like washing machines are going to become available because people now had money to spend, and electricity in homes is going to increase the demand for consumer appliances. The rise of credit in the form of installment plans is going to allow people to buy things now and pay later, but this also creates a lot of debt, and advertising is really going to increase consumer demand for everything. And the big idea is that while there was economic prosperity, unsustainable economic practices are going to emerge, eventually leading to the Great Depression. So during this time, there's also going to be a lot of advancements in transportation. The big cause of all of this was the massive increase in factory productivity. Again, we saw the rise of Taylorism as listed out in the principles of scientific management. We're also going to see the rise of the assembly line process. People like Henry Ford are really going to use the assembly line process to create the Model T, the first affordable automobile for Americans. This hurts the railroad industry, but leads to the growth of the oil, steel, rubber, and construction industries. There's also a lot of social impacts, and the automobile becomes a sign of freedom and equality. We also see the rise of planes. Charles Lindbergh is going to become the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic, making him a national hero. Next, mass media. The big idea is that the rise of mass media in the 1920s is going to have profound societal impacts. The big one is going to be the radio, which really brings the nation together by providing common experiences. We also see the rise of the movie industry with Hollywood. For example, the movie The Jazz Singer becomes really popular, and all of this is going to fuel the rise of celebrity culture, creating popular national figures like Babe Ruth. Another big idea were the changing gender roles. The big idea is that the 1920s is going to be marked by changing gender roles and the challenging of social customs. Jazz, drinking, dancing are all going to be challenges traditional values, and all of these are going to be very common during this time. Labor-saving devices like the washing machine are going to change the role of women as housekeepers because it now gives them more free time. This means more free time for leisure or more free time to fight for equality. The flappers, who are typically young women, are going to symbolize this new, more independent lifestyle. Another person that you should know is Margaret Sanger, who advocates for a women's right of birth control. Prohibition was another big thing. Recall that the 18th Amendment is ratified in 1919, and the Volstead Act is going to be passed to enforce prohibition. Obviously, there was fierce opposition in cities, especially amongst immigrants. We're going to see bootleggers that bring in illegally acquired alcohol, and the rise of speakeasies, which were illegal clubs that sold alcohol. And the reason why this happens is because law enforcement is understaffed and there's widespread corruption, and this allows for the rise of organized crime, like Al Capone. Ultimately, prohibition is going to fail and is overturned by the 21st Amendment. Nonetheless, it can still be seen as an experiment to reform morality. Now, African Americans. The big idea is that oppressive socio-economic conditions for African Americans are going to persist during this time. We see this in the form of Jim Crow laws, the resurgence of the KKK, pervasive lynching, and others. Regardless, African Americans are going to resist these injustices. For context, recall the trend of the First Great Migration, where African Americans moved to northern cities for jobs and to escape the South. With more concentrated African American populations, we're going to see the rise of African American culture. For example, we see the rise of jazz from New Orleans, and the big one is going to be the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural revival of African Americans centered in Harlem. You see famous writers like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, as well as famous artists like Louis Armstrong. There's also this idea of the new Negro, which called for racial pride. And outside of the Harlem Renaissance, we also see the formation of the United Negro Improvement Association, which was led by Marcus Garvey. And this is going to call for separatism, or the idea that African Americans should return to Africa. However, this movement also promotes Black pride, self-sufficiency, the growth of Black businesses, and other empowering things. So we're going to see a lot of change during this time period, and as you know, every single action is going to have an equal and opposite reaction. The big idea is that the 1920s was a clash between the new modern values of the cities and the traditional values of rural areas. There's the rise of the fundamentalist movement, which believed in a very literal interpretation of the Bible. Radio preachers like Billy Sunday are going to speak out against jazz, drinking, dancing, and others, reaching a much broader audience thanks to the radio. And really, the Scopes monkey trial is going to symbolize all of these tensions. You have a teacher, John Scopes, who was arrested for teaching evolution, which was illegal in Tennessee. And the prosecutor is going to be the fundamentalist and previous presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, while the defense was another famous lawyer called Clarence Darrow. Ultimately, Scopes is convicted but gets off on a technicality, but that's not important. This case is really going to demonstrate the growing clashes of values. You should also know about the Lost Generation. This was a group of writers like Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Lewis, who were all really famous American authors, and they're going to criticize many aspects of the 1920s. They were disillusioned with World War I. They question why America fought the war in the first place. They're also discontent with the clash between rural and modern values. They reject fundamentalism, but aren't happy with the growing consumerism and materialism of the decade. And really, these writers are going to symbolize a growing clash between the old and the new. Now, the Great Depression. So for some context, let's quickly cover the politics of the 1920s before moving on to the Great Depression. The big idea is that progressive reforms are largely going to be dropped during the 1920s, and big business and the government are going to become linked again and is very pro-business. All three presidents during this time, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, are going to favor trickle-down economics. The idea that if you favor big business, the benefits will trickle down to the rest of society. So policies include tax cuts and lax antitrust laws. High tariffs are also used. We're going to see the Forney-McCumber tariff, which greatly raises the tariff and reduces global trade because of tariff wars. The intertwining of big business and the government is going to lead to scandal and corruption. We're going to see the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Secretary of Interior Albert Fall takes bribes for leasing government lands to oil companies. You should also know that union membership generally declines during the 1920s. Companies are going to favor open shop policies, where you don't have to pay membership dues to a union after being employed, but will still be represented by a union. Additionally, the Palmer raids and the first Red Scare are generally going to increase anti-union sentiment. Farmers are also going to experience great economic difficulty in the 1920s. The key to all of this is overproduction due to the transition from wartime production to peacetime production. There are also advancements in technology, so there are just more crops being produced. Let's also cover foreign affairs. The big idea is that the US is an entirely isolationist after World War I and is still somewhat involved in world affairs. The US is going to attend the Washington Naval Arms Conference, which called for naval disarmament for peace. And this was endorsed by the 3 Republican presidents to reduce defense spending. From this conference, we have the 5-Power Treaty, 4-Power Treaty, and the 9-Power Treaty. We also see the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. Now this sounds great, but it's impossible to enforce and also allowed for defensive war, so it doesn't really work out. Another key thing to note is that after World War I, the US is going to become a creditor nation. The US will loan out lots of money to Europe for recovery. However, Europe will be slow to recover and repay its debts. There's high tariffs that slow down international trade, and German reparations were literally impossible to repay, so everyone was broke. To address this, the Dawes Plan was formed. American banks would loan money to Germany to rebuild, and reparation payments would be rescheduled. England and France would then receive these reparations and then pay back the United States. Now, this sounds great, but is ended by the stock market crash in 1929. Now for the causes of the Great Depression. The big idea is that unsustainable economic practices, economic downturn, and international involvement will all contribute to the Great Depression. We have buying on margin, which caused banks to fail, and massive unemployment after Black Tuesday, where stock markets plunge. This caused the foreclosure of homes, which means people start crowding soup kitchens and bread lines, living in cardboard towns known as Hoovervilles. Overproduction in both industry and agriculture was another cause. Prices were super low because supply was saturated, creating a lot of debt. There's also the Dust Bowl that impacts a lot of farmers. We even see a book, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck, that narrated problems that farmers faced. There were also growing wealth inequalities as corporations continued to profit while the workers didn't. The use of installment plans and the over-reliance on credit meant that people would start defaulting on loans because they don't have jobs, causing more banks to fail. Additionally, international problems, like reparations not being paid back and high tariffs that slow international trade, will all contribute. So what was Hoover's response to all of these problems? He is going to refuse to use government intervention during the Great Depression. Hoover really believes in individualism and thought that government intervention would be terrible for America. He cites this idea of volunteerism, that local governments, charities, and individuals should all band together to get past hard times. He also passes the Haley-Smoot tariff, which was the highest peacetime tariff, and this is disastrous because it worsens global trade and the economy even more. And as economic problems persisted, Hoover also passes the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which would use trickle-down economics. Money was given to big businesses, not people. And this was intended to stabilize wages, cut unemployment, but man, people will not like this. So in the election of 1932, we have Herbert Hoover against FDR. This guy pretty much does nothing to help the people. He bails out the rich and destroys the economy and is hated. On the other hand, there's FDR, who promised a New Deal. There was no clear plan, but it wasn't Hoover. So FDR is going to win in a landslide victory. Let's run through FDR's administration. FDR's famous brain trust was this diverse group of trusted advisors, including university professors. And I would tie this back to the Wisconsin idea. For example, the Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins became the first woman in the presidential cabinet. The big thing you need to know is the New Deal was a collective term to describe all of Roosevelt's policies. Keep in mind, there wasn't a clear plan from the very beginning. A lot of this was just experimentation, and people were actually happy about that. The New Deal is going to focus on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And Roosevelt creates so many agencies that historians sometimes call them the alphabet soup, which demonstrates the extent of the New Deal. And Roosevelt is also going to talk with everyday Americans through the fireside chats, which provided transparency and makes FDR wildly popular. In fact, the 100 Days tradition to determine presidential effectiveness actually starts with FDR, where Congress passed a lot of laws in the first 100 days. So we're going to blitz through the New Deal policies. The first big idea is that FDR is going to work to restore American confidence in banks. After all, a third of all banks had failed by 1933. He's going to declare bank holidays and uses his time to investigate all the banks, and he's going to communicate this in the fireside chats. The Emergency Banking Relief Act is passed, which stated that only financially stable banks can reopen. And in the Glass-Steagall Act, Congress regulated how deposits can be invested and creates the FDIC to ensure deposits. Later, the SEC is created, which regulates the stock market, intending to curb over-speculation. Next, unemployment relief. The big idea is that FDR will follow Keynesian economics, the idea that the government must increase federal spending to stimulate economic growth. After all, there was a 25% unemployment rate, and FDR sought to address this. The Federal Emergency Relief Act is passed, giving federal money to provide relief services like soup kitchens, shelters, and others. The CCC is created, which employed jobless men on conservation projects. The PWA is created, giving federal money to start public works projects to employ people. Additionally, the TVA is created, which created hydroelectricity projects in the Tennessee Valley region and controlled erosion, which provided jobs and developed this previously poor region. There's also industrial and agricultural recovery. The NRA is going to focus on industrial recovery, establishing fair wages and hours for workers. This set production limits and codes for hours and wages. In fact, Section 7A of this act codified the formation of unions, banning the use of yellow dog contracts. Additionally, the AAA is passed, and this paid farmers to cut production, curbing overproduction. However, both of these acts will be ruled unconstitutional. Now let's cover the second New Deal. The first New Deal was from FDR's 100 Days all the way up until 1935, and this primarily focused on recovery. It saw some success, but more was needed. Thus, the second New Deal is going to be created, focusing on reform and relief. The WPA is created, spending billions of dollars to create new jobs and infrastructure projects. This also employed artists, painters, and others. The Resettlement Administration is created, which gave loans to tenement farmers and sharecroppers who didn't own the land and were thus hurt by the AAA during the first New Deal. The big one is the Social Security Act, which creates Social Security, establishing federal responsibility for welfare. Money is going to be taken from employers and employees to grant pensions to those 65 plus, the disabled, mothers with dependents, the unemployed, and anyone else who needs assistance. This will definitely impact future generations and is massive because it provides a limited welfare state with a safety net. Another big one is the Wagner Act, the first federal law that protected the right to join a union. The National Labor Relations Board is created, which would enforce labor laws, and this really boosts the labor movement. Now, I know I've painted FDR in a very great light so far, but keep in mind that there were critics of the New Deal. The big idea is that while the New Deal did improve the economy was still unstable. So who were the critics? You have conservatives who essentially called FDR a socialist. They hated how he increased federal regulation and spending. Liberals, on the other hand, criticized FDR for not doing enough for the minorities and the poor. You have people like Dr. Francis Townshend, who proposed that people 60 plus would receive $200 a month to spend, which would stimulate the economy, while Huey Long pushed for wealth redistribution. Let's go over the court packing controversy as well. FDR is going to propose the court packing plan in 1937. Recall how the AAA and the NRA were ruled unconstitutional, and obviously FDR doesn't like that and wants to take over the Supreme Court. He proposes a plan where each judge over 70 would mean that FDR could appoint one additional judge. And critics, both Democrats and Republicans, call this an attack on checks and balances, and this bill will not be passed. For complexity, this sounds awfully similar to the Midnight Judges during the Adams administration. Now, the impact of the New Deal. The New Deal is going to have a drastic impact on American society. For one, African Americans are now going to vote Democrat. In fact, the Democrat Party will now be backed by farmers, immigrants, unions, blacks, and women. The New Deal also established the precedent that the federal government was responsible for a safety net for society. This is going to spark a debate over the welfare state that continues to this day. Another big idea is that while the New Deal does not end the Great Depression, it will provide great relief. Finally, the New Deal does not advance gender and racial issues. FDR actually does nothing on lynching, even though it was a huge issue in the South, and this is because he needed support from Southern congressmen. Now we're going to cover World War II. So let's run through FDR's foreign policy. FDR is going to work to improve foreign relations. He formally recognizes the Soviet Union, and this is because of a growing concern over the growing power of Germany and possible trade with the USSR. He announces the Good Neighbor policy, which denounced armed intervention in Latin America. Many provisions of the Platt Amendment, for example, are actually going to be repealed. There's also the Reciprocal Trade Agreement, where the US would reduce its tariffs if others did the same. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that lead up to World War II that I will not cover for time. Here are some terms in no order that you hopefully will remember. The most notable here is going to be the rise of totalitarianism. Just know that the US is going to remain neutral during all of this. Now let's cover US neutrality. This is really similar to World War I. The big idea is that the US is going to be neutral during World War II, but slowly get involved. The Nye Commission is going to be created to find out the causes for US entry into the war, and the general finding was that the greed of bankers and the arms industry caused US entry into World War I. This combined with American public sentiment of disillusionment by World War I means that America is going to stay neutral. Congress passes the Neutrality Acts as the threat of war looms in Europe and in Asia, and these are going to do a lot of things. For example, there were to be no American citizens on belligerent ships, no sale of arms to countries at war, and no loans to nations at war. And note that the US cannot help a country even if it was attacked first. The US is slowly going to get involved. The cash and carry program is going to be established, which allowed countries to buy arms with cash and transport the arms themselves. Most countries, however, cannot take advantage of this because they literally have no cash. The Selective Training and Service Act is going to create a peacetime draft. And note that during this time, Germany is going to begin bombing England, and there's a controversy to decide if we should help them or not. The Committee to Defend America advocated for the US to help England and the Allies, while the America First Committee wanted no US involvement at all. The Destroyers for Bases program will also be started. US destroyers are going to be given to England in exchange for military bases in the Western Hemisphere. Again, we are involving ourselves by giving arms to England. FDR is also going to win a third term, breaking the precedent. The big one, though, is going to be the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed US ships to ship arms on credit to countries that needed it. These countries would return the weapons after the war, but it was understood that that would never happen. This is an economic declaration of war. we're involved now. And the Great Depression is going to end as America's factories start churning out weapons. The Allied convoy system is established, where the US is going to escort weapon and supply shipments and had orders to fire on site at German ships. The Atlantic Conference is held, where FDR and Churchill meet secretly and establish the Atlantic Charter, which outlined post-war goals. They want a world with self-determination, free trade, no territorial gains, a new peacekeeping body, and others. So the US is finally going to enter the war because of Japan. Japan is going to invade China, and FDR is going to order an embargo on steel and iron. Japan keeps on invading other countries, and in response, FDR is going to put an oil embargo as well. This hurts Japan because the US is actually the biggest exporter of oil at this time, and the Japanese enter negotiations with the US. However, the Japanese will make a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, prompting the US to join the war. Now we're going to cover some big trends in World War II. The first big idea is that the role of the federal government is going to greatly increase as a result of World War II, much more than World War I or even the New Deal. And the US is going to enter total war, revamping its economy and society to fight. And this is going to cause the Great Depression to end. Again, our first big idea is that the role of the federal government will greatly increase as a result of World War II. We see this with the War Productions Board that controlled and dictated industrial output. Know that America's industry is going to be key to the Allied victory. The National War Labor Board comes back, which mediates strikes and labor disputes. The Office of Price Administration is going to control prices and rations. The Office of Research Development is going to develop technology to make weapons like radar, sonar, and rockets. The Manhattan Project is going to be started to create nuclear bombs and is going to be led by Oppenheimer. Next, World War II's impact on society. The big idea is that World War II is going to have a massive social impact, especially for minorities. For example, African Americans will receive many new opportunities but still face discrimination. We see the Second Great Migration, where over 1 million blacks leave the South to seek jobs in the defense industries, and they're still going to face a lot of discrimination. A. Philip Randolph is going to threaten a march on Washington if workplace discrimination is not addressed. And because of this, FDR is forced to ban discrimination in the defense industry with Executive Order AA02. We also see something called the Double Victory Campaign, where civil rights leaders push to win the fight against fascism abroad and to win the fight against racism at home. The NAACP membership increases, and the Congress of Racial Equality is going to be established to fight discrimination. However, not everything was good though. We're going to see the race riots of 1943. And even though 1 million African Americans served, they serve in segregated units like Tuskegee Airmen. And I would compare this to the Massachusetts 54th Regiment from the Civil War. Mexican Americans and natives were also impacted. The defense industry labor demand is going to give opportunities to thousands of Mexican Americans. In fact, we also see the Bracero program established. This allowed Mexican migrant farm workers to do work in the US without formal immigration proceedings because of the shortage of labor in agriculture. There obviously will be nativist backlash, like in the Zoot Suit riots, where racial tensions between white soldiers and Mexicans caused violence. Native Americans also get opportunities in the defense industry as well. We see the Navajo code talkers who play a key role in coded communication in the Pacific theater of the war. Also note that many Native Americans are not going to return to reservation life after the war. Women are also going to play a critical role in World War II. 5 million women are going to enter the workforce, and for many, this is their first job. Over 200,000 are going to serve in non-combat roles like we see in the Women Army Corps. And really, the importance of women and the new opportunities that they get can be symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Despite this though, women are going to receive lower pay and were seen as temporary substitutes, not permanent replacements. Generally speaking, there's also going to be demographic changes after the war across the board. Many are going to move to the West in the Sun Belt seeking defense work. More on that though next unit. Now, Japanese Americans. The big idea is that Japanese Americans were denied civil liberties and heavily discriminated against during the war. For example, Executive Order 9066 forced all Japanese Americans in the West Coast to be put in internment camps, even if they were American citizens who were born and raised in the US. And this removed 100,000 Japanese Americans. Surprisingly, Hawaii's massive Japanese population is not removed because they were too important to the economy. And then in Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court will unfortunately back the forced removal for national security reasons. And for complexity, we see time and time again how civil liberties are reduced, like in Schenck versus the United States, or the passage of the Sedition Act, or even Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. Despite this, though, Japanese American soldiers, many of whom families were stuck in these camps, will still fight bravely. Like the 100th Infantry Battalion, a part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was a segregated Japanese American attachment. They are a heavily decorated group and fought very valiantly. I'm going to run through the trajectory of the war. You don't need to know this is just here for reference. What you should know is that the tension between the United States and the USSR will start developing in the conferences between the big three. And we're going to run through all three of these conferences. The Casablanca Conference was only between the US and England. They want the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. I want to see tension because they decided to invade Italy first, which was bad for the Soviets because Stalin wanted to open a second front to take the load off the Soviet army. At Tehran, we're going to see the big three meet. Plans for a second front are decided, and they discuss the fate of Eastern Europe. And we see tension again because Stalin wants to divide Germany up, while the United States and England want free trade with Germany. The big one is going to be the Yalta Conference. This divides Germany, but promised free elections in Eastern Europe. The Soviets also agreed to help out with the Pacific Theater, and the UN is created. Now the Pacific Theater. The big idea is the US is going to be largely responsible for fighting the Pacific Theater. Their main strategy was island hopping, which is exactly what it sounds like. At Potsdam, Truman and Stalin are going to warn Japan to surrender unconditionally or be destroyed. Literally at the conference, Truman gets word that the bomb is successful. And on August 6th, the first atomic bomb is going to be dropped on Hiroshima. The USSR is going to join the war against Japan on the 8th, and then on the 9th, the second bomb is going to be dropped on Nagasaki. After this second bomb, Japan surrenders, ending World War II. And after World War II, the United States is going to be the dominant political and military country in the world. That is all for APUSH Unit 8 review. If you found this video helpful, then please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Thank you for watching.